Korea. Throughout most of its history, Korea has been divided, and that's still true in 2014. Japan and China often fought for Korea. Again, if you look on a map, it'll look like, well, Korea joins hard to China, but much of China is down in here, this region here. So in some ways, Japan was closer to Korea than China was. The Chinese usually crossed the sea to get to Korea rather than take the long way around. Crossing the sea was easier and shorter. But Korea is named after the Koryo, the dynasty that ruled Korea for a while. As was the case with Japan, Buddhism and smallpox both made their way into Korea. Smallpox, again, with fairly devastating results. The civil service exam also was done in Korea for a time, again with only male persons being allowed to take it. Buddhism now made a really strong headway in Korea, just like it did down here in Southeast Asia, until the main religion of Korea became Buddhism. Now fast forward to 2014, and the most Christian country on earth is South Korea. South Korea has about half its population, I understand, being Christian and half being Buddhism. But again, if you've heard differently, your input is welcome. But some of the largest Christian churches in the world are located here in South Korea. But Buddhism made strong headway into Korea. In North Korea, of course, communism came in and has done its share to impoverish North Korea. The Mongolians, when they came down from Mongolia, they swooped into Korea also, and they conquered Korea and held it for a while. Eventually, the Chinese and the Koreans were able to overthrow the Mongolians, but the Mongolians had some influence on the Koreans. All right, your book doesn't have a lot to say about Korea, so I'm going to move on to Vietnam. Vietnam, like Korea, has spent most of its time divided. However, since 1975, Vietnam has been united. Vietnam was very strongly influenced by China. Now, you might think that Laos and Cambodia are closer, but actually Vietnam is separated from its neighbors by some really, really rugged mountains that make it difficult to cross from one to the other. So that helped keep Vietnam a separate country. And Vietnam then was far more strongly influenced by its neighbor to the north, China, than it was by any other country. Early in its recorded history, the Chinese conquered Vietnam, and they held on to it for 1,000 years. And then they began what we call the process of sinification. In other words, the Chinese decided they were going to civilize the Vietnamese people. And one of the things the Chinese noticed that they did not particularly care for was that Vietnamese people, Vietnamese young couples, when they decided they liked each other, they would start living together without the benefit of a ceremony. Now, folk, each of you, I mean, I know that I'm speaking to a 21st century American class, and a lot of people today live together without the benefit of a ceremony called marriage or called a wedding. To each his own, but throughout most of history, persons who have lived together without the benefit of a ceremony have been looked down on as being primitive or lacking in culture. The Chinese told the Vietnamese that, hey, this is wrong. And they insisted that the Vietnamese couples, when they wanted to start living together, go through a ceremony first, known as a wedding. And eventually, the Vietnamese adopted the practice that they got from the Chinese. I mean, this was part of the process of sinification, in other words, civilizing the Vietnamese people. Now, unlike Korea and Japan, I mean, Vietnam is a tropical country. That is, they never have a winter. And I'm hesitant to say this, knowing some of you might be from tropical areas, but in general, tropical peoples have had a tendency to advance much more slowly and not advance as far as peoples from temperate climates. Why that is, I mean, I've heard it explained that tropical peoples know they can go out and plant any old time. People living in temperate climate, oh, we've got a small window of opportunity, we must get this garden planted right now. If we don't, now, my sister in Ohio was telling me that a couple of years back they had a real problem in Ohio where every time the weather didn't cooperate. And they would try to plant their crops and the rains would come. And you can't plow in the rain. Finally, they got a little bit lucky. They had about 2 or 3 dry days in there, and even though it was Sunday, they had to get out and plow their land and plant their crops while the ground was dry enough to plant it. But it looked like they were not going to get a planting without a planting season for farmers. But they only have a small window of opportunity, like right here. From what little I know about farming here, you have to plant most crops between April 15th and May 9th. That's about 3 weeks. And what if you plant them after May 9th? They'll rot in the ground. What if you plant them before April 15th? The frost will get them. Again, some of you might know what I'm talking about. I don't think many of you are farmers or sort of a farmer, but you have a small window of opportunity. And up farther north, you even have a smaller window. You've got to get the seed planted, so that might make them more industrial. And then come harvest time, you've got a small window of opportunity to harvest. And when harvest time, you've got to get out and harvest, because if the rain comes before the ripe crop is harvested, some crops will be ruined. So it's like you've got to be ready to move when the time comes and move fast. And tropical peoples don't have to worry about any of these problems. So some people believe that the hot climate also makes people, I hate to use this word, but I can't think of it, makes people lazy. Again, that's a negative term, and if it offends any of you, I'm really sorry, but another term I might use, less productive or less motivated, maybe less motivated, but whereas temperate people have to move when the season is right, and they only have a small opportunity to do it. Anyway, the earliest people we know of who lived in this region were the Viets. And that's where we get the name Vietnam. Now, many years ago, and I'm not talking about in my lifetime, but I'm talking about way back 1,000 or more years ago, North Vietnam and South Vietnam fought each other. And that time, South Vietnam won. And in my lifetime, North Vietnam and South Vietnam fought. And North Vietnam won. Their religion, as was the case of a lot of these peoples, Buddhism came in and exerted a really strong influence. But Chinese religion also had a strong influence, but Buddhism won out. And these people were more Buddhist than they were Confucian. However, they also practiced spirit worship, nature worship, known as animism. I've already written that word down, but they had particular people living in the jungles have a tendency, and this was true all over this region of Southeast Asia, as well as the peoples of Africa and the Indians, the tribal Indians of North and South America. They were animistic, nature worshippers, believing that nature was God or God was to be found in nature. So the more primitive people living in the interior were animistic. The more civilized people living in the cities who traded with the foreigners, who came in contact with foreigners, they tended to be mostly Buddhist. And that was true until modern times. The Mongolians, who were not able to conquer Japan, were able to conquer and hold Korea for a time. The Mongolians went down into Vietnam, and tried to conquer Vietnam, and they did succeed. However, the Vietnamese responded with guerrilla warfare. And the Mongolians found their losses really, really high. When the Vietnamese fight, they can fight with determination and skill. And guerrilla warfare meant that they would hide in the rice paddies, hide in the tall bamboo shoots, hide in the tall grasses, or hide in the thick jungle, strike the enemy with a spear, and then just disappear. It's a type of warfare that will not work in the wide open desert. The Mongolians were simply not equipped or trained to handle guerrillas, and after a short order, the Mongolians simply abandoned Vietnam and left it. And the Vietnamese people showed that we can resist incursions by foreigners. Now, fast forward, folk. History a lot of time repeats itself. During the 20th century, Vietnam drove out two powerful nations. First the French, then the United States. They go down in history as the only nation that can boast of having defeated the United States in a war. And again, in both cases, they used guerrilla tactics, and they used determination. Ho Chi Minh told the French ambassador one time, "You can kill us at a ratio of 10 to 1, but we'll keep coming back, and after a while, your people will get tired of fighting us and go home." That's exactly what happened. And it pretty much what happened in the United States also. In spite of having resisted Chinese rule, the Vietnamese wound up copying a lot of China, including the civil service exam. But unlike Japan and even unlike Korea, Vietnam allowed any male to take the exam right from the beginning. And part of this might have been that Vietnam did not and still does not have a very, very powerful, super rich upper class. Their people are more egalitarian and more equal. And this is true, by the way, of a lot of tribal societies or less developed societies. Folk, you can say all you want to against the rich, and it might be true the rich are snakes, but when you impoverish the rich, all of society goes downhill with them. You have to allow the rich to move forward, and when they do, they bring everybody else forward with them. The Vietnamese, apparently, either their rich did not have the ambition, or their rich were held back, whatever the reason. They didn't have very many rich, and as a result, they allowed everybody to take the exam. And that is one reason, I guess, why Vietnam embraced communism in the 20th century. Communism, as you know, is hard against rich folk. Their women, Vietnamese women were more equal than were the women of the other societies of this region. They could own property, but especially your book wants to emphasize they could initiate divorce proceedings against her husband, something that other societies disallowed. Well, in the case of Japan, they sometimes allowed it, sometimes didn't. Vietnam had a constant rule that's been in effect throughout most of their known history. Their women had the right to divorce their husbands should they wish to. And this tended to make the women more equal in this society than were in any of these other societies we know of in the Far East. The book meant Vietnamese women possessed more rights than they did in other parts of the world. Oh yes, and something else I must say about the Vietnamese women. I've had one student in the 14 years I've been here do a paper on this woman. Your book does make one little passing mention of her. But there was a Vietnamese woman who fought valiantly to rid her of the Chinese. I mean, during the 1,000 years that China controlled Vietnam, a woman rose up and led her people to fight against the Chinese. She could not drive the Chinese out, could not win, but she goes down as one of Vietnam's heroes. So Vietnam highly regards this woman for her gallantry, for her efforts. There may have been, your book mentions there may have been several women. I mean, I had a student do a paper on one of them. There may have been several women who fought hard to encourage the Vietnamese men to fight for the freedom of their homeland, to where they'd be independent of the annoying and tax collecting people of China. Again, we're going to talk in the next chapter about a gallant woman named Joan of Arc who influenced her people to fight against the British. And the British also have a history of a very gallant woman who rose up in rebellion against Rome and led a rebellion against Rome. She lost. Joan of Arc led her people to victory at the expense of her life. These Vietnamese women were not able to drive out their men. We're not able to drive out the Chinese, but they did resist heroically. Africa, too, has a tradition. When European colonialists took over Africa, their women encouraged their men to keep on fighting, fight on, and their men lost, but eventually the fighting paid off because eventually Europeans did give their people freedom. All right, folk.